Boom, and just like that, it is week 15 of the fantasy season. It is the first round of the fantasy playoffs, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, break down every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting, who you should be sitting here in week 15 of the fantasy season. All right, let's kick it off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Falcons traveling to face the Buccaneers in a big divisional matchup, at least for the Buccaneers side of things. Let's start with the Falcons wide receivers. We did not see Drake London suit up this past week against Seattle. We have not seen him in action since week 11 of the season. So his status still up in the air going into week 15. No early reports here indicating anything too positive or negative. We just know that he has that knee injury and he missed this past week. So we'll see if he suits up or not. I mean, the Falcons not really a ton to play for at this point in the season. The passing attack, not great particularly here, but this is a good matchup. Buccaneers bottom 12 in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So I still think Drake London, with the upside that he has on a week-to-week basis, even with the struggling passing attack with the Falcons and Kirk Cousins at quarterback, Drake London still got to be a start in this matchup for me. Darnell Mooney going to remain a sit. We kind of had him like near the risky flex area, but just one catch this past week, 2 catches in week 13. I mean, barely did anything in week 12. He just bailed you out with that touchdown towards the end of the game. So I'm not risking it. In the first round of the playoffs, no thank you. Darnell Mooney is going to be a sit. Now, we do have a bit of a conundrum here with the Buccaneers wide receivers, and, we're only going to have so much time to really look at this wide receiver room going into the short week, right? But we might get Mike Evans back in the mix here in week 15. There is a possibility that he will make his return from injury, dealing with that collarbone issue, but we don't know for sure. And, at the time of recording this, so we'll find out in the next couple of days, right? And I just think that all 3 of these Buccaneers wide receivers are risky flexes because we don't know how Mike Evans is going to impact the overall volume here. Chris Godwin's been okay the past 2 weeks with 10.5 or more fantasy points. But what does it mean with Mike Evans back in the mix? Does that help Chris Godwin? Maybe. Does it not help him? Maybe. And then Emeka Egbuka is still seeing the best volume share right now. 8 or more targets in every game since week 7. But he has 8 or 9 or less fantasy points in 4 straight games. And I encourage a lot of you guys to consider benching Emeka Egbuka this past week. And I haven't considered him anything more than a flex for a couple of weeks now. But the volume is still there. But then once again, with Mike Evans in the mix, what does that mean for Emeka Egbuka? I think the best outcome is that it helps him. But also, at the end of the day, the other thing I've been bringing up is that Baker Mayfield is playing through injuries. May not be on the injury report, but something is off. And, throwing the football, he has not been effective over the past 4 weeks with 194 or less passing yards in the last 4 games and 3 interceptions as well as 2 fumbles in those games as well. So I'm just going to say risky flex options, but with the Bucs coming off of that loss this past week to the Saints, this is a big divisional game for the Buccaneers and, their playoff seedings, playoff push here before they are on the road next week against the Panthers and then face the Panthers again in week 18. So the Bucs will be coming out here doing whatever they can to win this game. So I do think that there's potential here, but the volume overall is certainly a bit concerning when it comes to the Bucs wide receivers. All right, moving into Sunday's slate of games, the early window, we're going to kick it off with the Ravens traveling to face the Bengals. Let's start with Zay Flowers, who had a really nice performance in Week 14, 20.6 fantasy points, 11 targets, 8 catches, total of 124 receiving yards against the Pittsburgh Steelers. We'll be on the road this week in a big matchup for the Ravens against the Bengals. And I know he's coming off of a really good game, his second best on the season, but I still just consider Zay Flowers kind of a low-end start. He's still a good start, don't get me wrong, but yeah, I mean, we're looking at 14.9 or less fantasy points in every game this year except for 2. The floor is definitely there, but we have to remember, I mean, he got the Steelers this past week who have struggled heavily against the wide receiver position in the bottom 10 against opposing wide receivers on the season in terms of fantasy points allowed. This week he gets the Bengals, and I've been saying it for weeks. This Bengals defense is not bad when it comes to opposing wide receivers. They've given up the 5th fewest fantasy points 2 opposing wide receivers on the season so far. And yeah, they suck against the run. They suck against the tight end position. So teams don't really need to throw to wide receivers against them. But still, they're also not bad at defending the wide receiver position. Over the last 4 weeks, the fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. Over the last 2 weeks, the fewest fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So this is a unit that I still think is kind of a tough matchup here. And yeah, it's a big game for the Ravens and, them trying to still have the potential to win that division. So I do think that this will be a good competitive game script here. But I just don't know if Zay Flowers is going to have a super high ceiling because, once again, we've only seen it twice so far on the season. Any other Ravens wide receiver here, we don't even need to break them down. They're just going to be sits for me. Then we move to the Bengals wide receivers, right? Jamar Chase, not a really good game this past week. 10 fantasy points, 8 targets, 5 catches, 44 receiving yards in the snow, but also a tough matchup against the Buffalo Bills. But man, T. Higgins showed up. The matchup didn't matter. The snow didn't matter. 27.2 fantasy points, 11 targets, 6 catches, 92 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. And yeah, the Ravens defense has improved, but they're still bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. And yeah, sure, the Bengals really not in position here to be making a playoff push anymore necessarily. But they're going to come out here and try and spoil a divisional opponent. We know that for sure. And, the last time these two teams played, Chase did have a good game. Higgins was out with that concussion. So, we should get good output out of both of these guys. And, as long as they're both healthy and on the field, Andre Ujavis, Mitchell Tinsley, these guys aren't going to be in consideration. So we'll see how it shakes out. But I think for the most part, your stud wide receivers in this matchup are going to be in your lineup here in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Moving along, we got the Raiders traveling to face the Eagles. Let's start with the Raiders side of things. Trey Tucker, Tyler Lockett, Donta Thornton, Jack Bech, whoever it is. I mean, Jack Bech did have actually a pretty nice game this past week. It was his first double-digit game on the season, but yeah. Whoever it is, I am not starting a single Raiders wide receiver. There's no doubt about it in my mind, not against this Eagles defense, which this Eagles defense does have its flaws, don't get me wrong. But yeah, Geno Smith, questionable. Is it going to be Kenny Pickett? Is it going to be Aiden O'Connell? Is it going to be Geno Smith? I don't know. I don't care. These guys have all been sits for me for weeks, and they're going to be sits again here. The first round of the playoffs, way too risky to, for some reason, consider any of these guys. Now, I am recording this before Monday Night Football of Week 14 has been played. I always have to record these videos early on Monday, so I do apologize if anything crazy happens with the Eagles wide receivers, if there's any injuries or anything that changes my mind. My thoughts will be in a pinned comment down below, but for the most part, this is a smash matchup. The Raiders, 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Great spot at home for the Eagles. A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith have still been plenty productive on the season. They're still both good starts in a matchup that the Eagles are going to be wanting to win. Regardless of what happens against the Chargers, this will still be a game that the Eagles want to win as they're still chasing the potential for the number 1 overall seed in the NFC. Don't know if they're going to quite catch it, but they have a chance. They're still going to be coming out here at home trying to dominate a team like the Raiders. So A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith still will be very good starts as long as they're healthy here in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Moving along here, we have the Cardinals traveling to face the Texans. Let's start with the Cardinals side of things. Marvin Harrison Jr. missed this past week with a heel injury, and that led to a Michael Wilson, a wide receiver one day, 2 receiving touchdowns, nearly had a third, 142 catches off of 16 targets, 142 receiving yards, 11 catches off of 16 targets. I mean, at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if Michael Wilson had 142 catches in a game as long as Marvin Harrison Jr. wasn't on the field. But nonetheless, 37.2 fantasy points here. So if he's the wide receiver one, if there's no Marvin Harrison Jr., he's still a start, but he's a low-end start because this Texans defense, man, they just don't play around. 3rd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. They are stout against every position. We know what this Texans defense is. And yeah, Jacoby Brissett has been perfectly fine, and even against a tough defense in the Rams this past week, he still came through and threw 2 touchdowns, over 270 passing yards, and the Cardinals are going to sling it as long as the game is active and going on. They're going to sling it around. So Michael Wilson, a low-end start if MH Jr. does not play. And if MH Jr. plays, he's a low-end start. They're both in the start category. But, yeah, you got to temper expectations here against this Texans defense. So they're not my favorite starts this week, even with how productive, they have been, or at least Michael Wilson has been. And Marvin Harrison Jr. has still been plenty good this year. I know he gets a bad rap, but he's had double digits in every game this year except for 4. So you still got to feel good about him. Maybe not due to the matchup, but overall, I think you can feel good about him if he plays, right? And then Greg Dortch is on IR, so there's really no other wide receiver here who I think we need to talk about. But we'll see how it shakes out. Point being, it's a tough matchup against the Texans. Now, we look to the Texans wide receivers here. They're in a much better spot, although the Cardinals defense has been quietly pretty good against wide receivers. They've been a bit wishy-washy, 17th overall against the position. If you own Nico Collins, you just play him. 16.1 fantasy points this past week, 8 targets, 4 catches, 121 receiving yards. He stays in your starting lineups. The Texans in this type of position here, they're going to be doing whatever they can to get as many wins here over the next couple of weeks as they are making their own playoff push. And technically, the AFC South is still wide open. Jaden Higgins, I still think, is a solid flex option. 5 targets, 3 catches, 34 receiving yards this past week. Not great, but he's still been the true wide receiver 2 for the Texans at the end of the day. And next to Dalton Schultz at the tight end position, seeing the most consistent volume here. Christian Kirk had 3 targets, 1 catch this past week. Xavier Hutchinson, 2 targets, 0 catches, and Jalen Noel, 2 targets, 2 catches. So the target volume is still the next best for Jaden Higgins at the end of the day. And Dalton Schultz, only 4 targets this past week. So this is a bit of a better matchup than we saw this past week against the Chiefs. Texans trying to win as much as they can. Maybe he's a bit of a risky flex, but still, Jaden Higgins has had 3 touchdowns and 4 double-digit performances since week 8 of the season. So I still feel pretty good about him. Solid flex option if you guys have nothing better going into week 15. Next up, we will have the Chargers traveling to face the Chiefs. And once again, I am recording this before Monday Night Football week 14 has been played, so don't yell at me if there's any Chargers injuries to wide receivers. There'll be a pinned comment down below if my thoughts change here. But really where I've been at for the past couple weeks is Ladd McConkey is in the start category. I would argue we've seen the most consistency or most consistent target share out of Ladd over the past couple weeks of any of these Chargers wide receivers. And then Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston, both in the flex category. I kind of prefer Quentin Johnston, but it's still risky with both these guys. I think it's kind of tough to look back to week 1 when these two teams played. Like Ladd had 13.4 fantasy points. Remember, Keenan Allen had 19.8. Quentin Johnston had 24.9 and 2 receiving touchdowns. Allen had a receiving touchdown as well. So that feels like a long time ago. It feels like this offense has changed a lot. They have some offensive line injuries. They've had, now Amarian Hampton back on the field, who's been out for a while. So I don't want to read too much into that matchup. I mean, that was, 14 weeks ago at this point. So Ladd McConkey in the start category. Big game for the Chargers here as they're making their own playoff push. Probably not going to win that division, but they do technically have a chance. And regardless, they're in a very good spot for a wild card spot, where the Chiefs are in a not so good spot for a wild card spot whatsoever. This is a must-win game for the Chiefs and Arrowhead against a divisional opponent. So the stakes are high here. So I like just about all the Chargers wide receivers, but bear in mind, it's not a great matchup. The Chiefs 14th overall against opposing wide receivers. They have been stout and they're good at stopping wide receivers in the end zone. But bear in mind, over the past few weeks, we look at the last 4 weeks, the Chiefs, the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers. Over the last 2 weeks, the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers. But a lot of that stems from that matchup against Dallas on Thanksgiving Day. But still, the Chiefs, and they are banged up in the secondary too. So there's going to be opportunity here. But I have a tough time sometimes, this time of year. It does feel like that, defense can always show up, especially in Arrowhead. But still, Ladd, Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston, they're all worth, consideration for sure here in Week 15 as long as they are healthy. Now we go to the Chiefs side of things. Rashee Rice this past week, it wasn't bad necessarily, but it wasn't great for fantasy. 7.4 fantasy points, 8 targets, 4 catches, 34 receiving yards. Did have some drops, so I guess you could argue he was bad. And yeah, this Chargers defense, they have been very stout against wide receivers on the year. We'll see if their ranking changes after Monday Night Football. It definitely could, but right now, going into Week 14, second fewest fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, and we know the secondary has been stout, but man, I know it's rough going off of this past week, but the involvement was still there for Rashee Rice, so I'm going to keep him in the start category. I don't particularly love Xavier Worthy or Hollywood Brown, but they're kind of in that desperation, risky flex category. Once again, everything's on the line here. Must-win game for the Chiefs. It is a tough matchup. I'm not going to be looking to start Worthy or Hollywood Brown, but these are the two guys who can always get enough volume or score a touchdown that they do at least get you like 10, 11, 12 fantasy points, but definitely not my favorite options. And yeah, Rashee Rice, the volume was good last week. Maybe his output wasn't as good as expected, but you got to expect he will be involved again here in week 15 and be the primary wide receiver one. Had 8 targets this past week, so I'm going to leave him as a start here in week 15. And real quick, guys, before we break down the rest of the matchups here, Underdog has a brand new exclusive offer to all new customers who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH. Once you play through $5 on Underdog, you're going to receive $75 in bonus funds to use towards week 15 NFL action. And on top of that, as long as you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH, you're going to get that free NFL pick'em to use towards week 15 NFL action. Take that free pick'em. Take any player line that you like in week 15, and if both of those lines hit, you'll automatically double your cash entry. And on top of all that, they're also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up using promo code THECATCH. So make sure you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH if you want to take advantage of all of their Week 15 exclusive NFL offers. Moving along, we have the Bills traveling to face the Patriots. Let's start with the Bills side of things. Khalil Shakir, not a lot going on in the snow. 3 targets, 2 catches against the Bengals, but he did have a touchdown, 16 receiving yards, 9.6 fantasy points. Try not to read too much into like snow games, especially for wide receivers. But when it comes to Khalil Shakir, I just consider him a low-end start every single week. The floor is pretty safe. And Patriots 16th against wide receivers, kind of middle of the pack. So there should be opportunity in what is a big game for both of these teams. So I do like Khalil Shakir here as the Bills continue to make that push for either a wild card spot, or technically they do have a chance to win the division, although the chances are looking slim, and this game will definitely be a big determination of the possibility for that. So I like Shakir. I'm not going to consider any other Bills wide receiver anything going into this matchup. Then we move over to the Patriots. We did not see them in action this past week as they were on their bye week, and Stephon Diggs hasn't done a whole lot in the last 2 games, 5.6 or less fantasy points. Didn't really need to do anything in week 13 against the Giants, but week 12 against the Bengals, remember, the Patriots were playing from behind in that game. And once again, that Bengals secondary found a way to slow down Stephon Diggs. But, you know, this is a big game, a lot of magnitude in this matchup. And, yeah, the Bills 13th overall against wide receivers, not the greatest spot here, and they were ranking much higher before giving up, you know, a decent game to Jamar Chase this past week and a big game to T. Higgins. So it's still a tough matchup, but it's at home for the Patriots here. They're coming out of their bye week, so ultimately I still think Diggs is a good low-end start. I think Kayshon Boutte is a good flex option. Remember, you know, he missed a couple weeks, was slow in his return in week 12 against the Bengals, but then got nice involvement in week 13 against the Giants and did score an early touchdown. So he's kind of a risky flex option, don't get me wrong, but I still think he's in the mix. And then any other Patriots wide receiver, you know, they do show up at times due to the magnitude of this offense, how much they throw the football and the success they have throwing the football. But really the only guys I would trust in lineups are Stephon Diggs and Kayshon Boutte here in week 15. All right, moving along here, we have the Jets traveling to face the Jaguars. Let's start with the Jets side of things. John Mechie, A.D. Mitchell. Oh, man, I don't know. I don't feel good about either of these guys this weekend. You know, the volume was there. We had talked about them both in waiver videos, but then as last week progressed, I did talk about this on Saturday night's live stream, like, I think we're going to get into a trap here of like the flip-flop between A.D. Mitchell, who had the production in week 13, and John Mechie, who did not have the production in week 13, but had the production in the previous 2 games. And then what in the world are we actually going to get in week 14? It's just too risky. Yeah, John Mechie had the better volume this past week. A.D. Mitchell had 6 targets, but just 1 catch, you know. So, and then the quarterback situation, Tyron Tyrod Taylor, banged up. Justin Fields wasn't active last week because he has a knee injury. So it's Brady Cook, and then going into week 15, we don't know who the starter is at the time I'm recording this, and if Tyrod Taylor is going to be able to play or not. So there's a chance he can play. Doesn't really matter. This Jaguars defense is nothing to sneeze at. Now, the spot they do struggle the most against is the wide receiver position and the tight end position for what it's worth. But yeah, this is a good spot for the Jaguars defense. That defensive line, very good. They're good at getting after the quarterback. They're good at stopping the run. So John Mechie, AD Mitchell in week 15, first round of the playoffs. I'm staying away from both these guys. No bye weeks this week. I know there's injuries out there, but hopefully you don't have to rely on either of these guys. Now, I do have John Mechie listed, Jacoby Myers, switching to the Jaguars here, listed as a low-end start, and that should really be swapped to just a start. So I do apologize, forgot to switch that. But he's been very solid over the past 3 weeks. A touchdown in each of the last 3 games, 14.8 fantasy points this past week. Also 10 targets this past week, only 4 catches, but he has solidified himself as the wide receiver 1. Now, if we were to argue for the low-end start side of things, the Jets have still been stout against wide receivers. Even since trading Sauce Gardner, they've still remained a top 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. They haven't faced the strongest teams necessarily, but still they've been, high in that ranking. So I don't know. I still like Jacoby Myers. The Jaguars are going to try and come out here and get a win, continue to stay at top of their division. Not that this is a divisional opponent necessarily or anything like that, but they still want to make sure they're getting more wins than both the Colts and the Texans, who are right there in that AFC South race. So I do think that the Jaguars will come out here at home and try and to do whatever they can, not take the foot off the gas against the Jets. So I really like Jacoby Myers this week, but, Brian Thomas is kind of the reason why we looked at Myers as a lower end start this past week, because we knew he was going to play, and then we didn't know Parker Washington was going to play, what the volume might look like. Then Brenton Strange is still getting volume at the tight end position. But Parker Washington inactive this past week. We'll see if he plays. If he does, he's just a risky flex. Brian Thomas did show up to some degree, only had 3 catches, but 87 receiving yards, so 11.7 fantasy points. And if you were forced to start Brian Thomas Jr., you will take that compared to the 8.5 or less fantasy points in the 3 previous games he played in and the 3 games that he missed over the last 6 weeks. So he's in the mix, risky flex. With Parker Washington potentially coming back, we'll see if that impacts things. But I do like Jacoby Myers going into week 15. He's definitely my favorite wide receiver in this matchup. All right, next up we will have the Commanders traveling to face the Giants. Let's start with the Commanders side of things. I have both Deebo Samuel and Terry McLaurin listed as flex options, but I have to say, I think they are good flex options this week. Only 6.7 fantasy points against the Vikings this past week for Deebo, only 7.1 for Terry. Jaden Daniels goes down. Marcus Mariota's back on the menu here at the starting quarterback position. And he did struggle in relief of JD5 this past week, but that Vikings defense, I said it all week, they're very good against wide receivers, and they are good against quarterbacks. This week, we're going to see the Giants, and it is a road game here for the Commanders, but the Giants' 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, 2nd most to quarterbacks. So you got to imagine this is going to be a much better spot. And yeah, nobody really playing for anything in this game. But these NFC East teams, they will come out and try and smack each other around, even if it's the end of the season and there's no playoff implications here. So 2 bad defenses. We should see points in this game, regardless of, what quarterbacks are active and if Zach Ertz is hurt or, doom and gloom for both these teams, whatever it may be. So Terry McLaurin, Deebo should have bounce back weeks. I think they're strong flex options going into week 15 and should definitely be in consideration in your guys' starting lineups. Then we kind of have the same scenario, except we know we're going to get Jackson Dart at quarterback. He played in week 13. He's going to be good to go coming out of the bye week here. And it's a really bad secondary here for the Commanders, still bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. And so Rondell Robinson, solid flex option, 10.4 fantasy points the last time we saw him play. 30.6 the previous week, although that was with Jameis Winston at quarterback. But yeah, Darius Slayton did get a little bit of involvement in week 13. He scored a touchdown, but he only had 2 catches, 14.1 fantasy points. I don't know that I feel too confident in risking him this week. And then Isaiah Hodgins came back to earth in week 13 with just 1 catch. So I like Robinson, solid flex option. Once again, 2 bad defenses. We should see points scored. It's just one of these things where the offenses themselves kind of cap the overall ceilings. But I think, we have some really solid flex options due to the matchup here in Week 15 between the Commanders and the Giants. All right, moving along, we have the Browns traveling to face the Bears to close out the early window. Let's start with the Browns side of things. Some life in that passing attack this past week against the Titans. That offense starting to open up. Shedeur Sanders officially going to be the starting quarterback as long as he's healthy for the rest of the season for the Browns. And, you know, they played the Titans, don't get me wrong, but 364 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, a rushing touchdown for Sanders. There's some real heartbeat to this offense all of a sudden. And Jerry Jeudy, 3 catches off of 5 targets, 76 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 16.6 fantasy points for him. He's risky still, and, you know, I still don't know that I particularly trust any wide receiver on this team. But if we're going to trust one, if we're in a bad spot, it's going to be Jerry Jeudy. And the Bears, the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers, and they've still dealt with injuries all year long in that secondary. I know Jalen Johnson was able to play this past weekend. Yeah, they still are opportunistic and can, you know, cause turnovers, but they've also given up 19 receiving touchdowns on the season so far, which is the 3rd most in the league, only behind the Lions and the Cowboys. So it's a good spot. Judy's very risky. We'll see how it shakes out. The Bears coming off of a loss. I'm a little, you know, I do think it's a bit of a tough matchup here for the Browns, but Jerry Jeudy in the risky flex conversation. And I think either of the wide receivers for the Bears here, not named DJ Moore, are in the risky flex conversation. We'll see if Rome Odunze is able to play. He did not play this past week. And, you know, obviously he hasn't done anything in this past 3 starts with 8.3 or less fantasy points. So in terms of risky flex options, like, he's up there with some of the riskiest potential options. And the Browns, the 4th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. So I'm leaving him in this area, but I don't like him. I would be really concerned if I had to start Odunze here in Week 15. But we know he can always go off, can always score. It's just, you know, he's only done it like 6 times this year. And although he was doing it consistently in September, that feels like it was a very, very long time ago. Nonetheless, Luther Burden was able to get some more volume this past week with DJ Moore acting as the primary wide receiver 1. Burden, 11 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 catches, 67 receiving yards. So he remains in the risky flex category, regardless really if Odunze plays or not. And then DJ Moore, I mean, come on, 1 catch for -4 receiving yards. I was in a league where I desperately needed a wide receiver, where I realized I hadn't really spent any fab this year, so it's not like it really matters here, and I was in a must-win situation. I spent like 61 fab on DJ Moore and started him. So anyways, I maybe I'm just holding a grudge here, but yeah, regardless if Odunze plays or not, I'm just not doing the DJ Moore experience here in Week 15 against this Brown secondary. Way too risky. We'll look to Odunze as at least a player that has some upside, and then Luther Burden, who maybe has a better floor when it comes to the Bears wide receivers here in Week 15. All right, let's move into the afternoon slate, starting with the Panthers traveling to face the Saints. We will have the Panthers coming off of their bye week. Let's look to rookie wide receiver T-Mac, who we last saw have 11.3 fantasy points and a touchdown against the Rams. 4 touchdowns in his last 3 games, and this offense starting to open up a bit. Bryce Young showing some life here late in the season. They'll face the Saints defense this week, who are certainly nothing to sneeze at. The 11th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. But like I said, Bryce Young has been okay, good enough over the past 3 games. He has 7 total passing touchdowns, but you never exactly know what you're going to get out of Bryce Young. But I still think T-Mac is a start. Maybe the ceiling not as high this week, but he has the potential to score, you know, touchdowns and get involvement. I mean, remember in Week 13, he only had 1 catch. It was just a 43-yard touchdown. So that was a weird, you know, game in terms of what the Panthers were able to do. Then the previous week, he only had 2 catches. That was another weird game. Like, the Panthers were actually, you know, making some noise defensively, and T-Mac just wasn't really involved, and then he had kind of that later, you know, touchdown or whatever. So, listen, I still like T-Mac. I think he's a solid start, but, there's always risk when it comes to the Panthers offense. We know that. All right. Chris Olave, I think, remains in the start category for me. Remember, he played a little bit banged up this past week, so I guess maybe that was part of the issue, but only 6 fantasy points, 5 targets, 3 catches, 30 receiving yards. But, it was also kind of a gross weather game. But, the game script was there for Olave to be needed, and he didn't really do a whole lot. Then Devon Vele did have 5 targets, but I don't know. I don't want to go he had the big game against Miami. A lot of us chased those points because it was a good matchup in week 14. Then it just wasn't there. And then, the Saints will run the football with Tyler Shuck near the goal line, 2 rushing touchdowns. And, that's all he's had on the season. But we've seen a lot of attempts near the goal line in terms of Tyler Shuck trying to run in the football. And, Jawan Johnson still involved, Devin Neal, maybe Kamara involved here. So I'm just out on Devon Vele, and this Panthers defense, sneaky. They're sneaky good, man. And the 7th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers on the season so far. So bear that in mind as well. But Olave, tough player to bench. I'm going to leave him as a start. I'm going to leave T-Mac as a start. But yeah, maybe these guys are lower end starts here in week 15. All right, next up we will have the Lions traveling to face the Rams in what should be one of the better matchups of Week 15. Last time we saw the Lions back on Thursday Night Football, and it was unclear if Amon-Ra St. Brown was going to be able to play or not with that ankle issue, but he fought through it, suited up, and he was productive as well. Wasn't just out there as a decoy. 9 targets, 6 catches, 92 receiving yards, 15.2 fantasy points. So he remains in starting lineups for me. No matter what, I know it was kind of a last-minute call there, but I have Amon-Ra in a couple leagues and had him benched just in case. And I went through and I just said, you know what, I'm just going to roll with him. And I think you guys should continue to do so in this big matchup against the Rams. Rams defense, we know it's good, but 18th most fantasy points to wide receivers, kind of middle of the pack there against the wide receiver position. So ultimately, he's still a strong start. And I think Jameson Williams continues to be a strong start. He nearly had, that touchdown early in the game, but 9 targets, 7 catches, 96 receiving yards, 17.3 fantasy points. He's seen plenty of involvement. Like the Week 12 matchup against the Giants still makes no sense to me. But outside of that, since Week 9, he's had a touchdown and or 16.6 or more fantasy points in every game. So J-Mo got to remain in starting lineup, still a top 20 wide receiver so far on the season in both half and full PPR. Then Isaac Tesla, I'm going to leave him in the risky flex category because I know he's gotten the involvement, because we saw the injury to Amon-Ra in week 13, so he scored a touchdown there. But even this past week, it feels like there's the potential here for Tesla to continue to have some plays that are kind of drawn up for him, like we saw in week 14 against the Cowboys, where he was able to score a touchdown. So risky flex, but in a game where we're expecting points to be scored and the stakes are high for both of these teams, I think that he could get involvement and have another stat line that results in 10-ish fantasy points. So a true desperation flex and very risky, but some of you guys in deeper leagues, he could be a play for you. Then we move to the Rams. Puka Nacua, come on, 35.7 fantasy points. No reason to be panicked about Puka, who, hadn't been scoring as many touchdowns. It was every game, Devontae Adams, Kyren Williams, Blake Corum. And, Puka has still been plenty productive and had 2 touchdowns since week 9 of the season before this game. But, maybe the ceiling was starting to feel capped for some of you Puka Nacua owners. But, yeah. Nothing to worry about. 35.7 fantasy points this past week. A monster game against the Cardinals. Now he's getting the Lions, who give up the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers, the 2nd most touchdowns to wide receivers. You got to feel great here. Once again, this is a big game for the Lions and their playoff push. This is a big game for the Rams fighting for the potential number 1 overall seed in the NFC. And yeah, we got that Goff-Stafford narrative. Always good when these two teams meet, right? So Puka must start. And yeah, Devontae Adams finally had a week where he slowed down. No touchdowns this week. Had a touchdown in every game since week 7. Had a touchdown in every game of the season, except for 4, including this past week. And yeah, 6 targets, 4 catches, 29 receiving yards, 6.9 fantasy points. Puka balled out. Kyren balled out. Colby Parkinson had a touchdown. Blake Corum balled out. It happens, guys. Not everybody, and even in this offense, can score every week and have huge games, but still, like I said, Adams has been plenty productive. Only 4 weeks on the season where he hasn't given you double digits, and it's a smash matchup at home. There's going to be offense in this game. Devontae Adams, still a must-start wide receiver going into Week 15. All right, next up we have the Colts traveling to face the Seahawks. Let's start With the Colts side of things, Michael Pittman, 16.9 fantasy points against the Jags this past week, 12 targets, 9 catches, 79 receiving yards. Came through for you guys. Good matchup on paper for him. But yeah, the most important thing here is the Achilles injury to Daniel Jones, which is likely to set Riley Leonard as the starting quarterback this week against the Seahawks defense. This is a bad spot for this Colts offense. I'm very worried about them. The Seahawks, the 6th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. You can't feel good here, but Pittman, due to volume and still the production he has had on the season, remains a startable wide receiver. But yeah, you got to be a little bit worried, maybe down to like a flex option for you guys, but can definitely still be in starting lineups because, once again, the volume should be there. But I'm still worried here. Then Alec Pierce, a little bit banged up this past week, has an undisclosed injury, although he did have 13 fantasy points. But, you know, I went really back and forth here. Josh Downs, 6.3 fantasy points this past week. I went really back and forth, between Josh Downs and Alec Pierce. Like, should I call them risky flexes or should I call them sits? And I'm just going to call them sits. I am worried about this passing attack for the Colts. And, you know, last week it was a better matchup against the Jaguars in a game where, like, the Colts had to throw and the Jaguars, like, whatever, you know, throw against us. Like, we're going to win this game either way, the way the score was. So it's not going to be that way this way on the road, or this week, on the road against the Seahawks. And I'm just worried, like, sure, desperation flexes and Downs and Pierce is fine, especially if Pierce misses, then Downs has more, you know, potential volume. But if Pierce plays, like, desperation flexes only. And Pittman, like, I am even worried about having him as a startable player. He might be closer to the flex. I'm really worried about this Colts passing attack here in week 15 of the season. But crossing my fingers, Riley Leonard does come through. But it's going to be a tough task against a absolutely humming Seahawks defense. Jackson Smith-Njigba, no question about it. You were starting him. 28.1 fantasy points this past week, 2 touchdowns, 7 catches off of 10 targets, 92 receiving yards. And the Colts have struggled against opposing wide receivers, bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So great spot at home. Seahawks going to continue to try and dominate on a week-in, week-out basis. Great spot. It's JSN, number 1 wide receiver in all formats. You're rolling with him. But worth noting, this Seahawks passing attack opened up a bit this past week. Rashid Shaheed had 4 catches, 67 receiving yards. Finished with 16.7 fantasy points because he was very effective in the special teams game and had a kickoff return for a touchdown, a very long one at that. And then Cooper Kupp also showed some life with 11.5 fantasy points and a receiving touchdown. So I don't quite know if the Seahawks are going to throw as much here in week 15 or really need to. So I think they're risky flexes and I wouldn't bank on them. Like, I wouldn't go out of my way to start them, but hopefully we're seeing the Seahawks passing attack open up a bit. It really stalled the running backs this past week. And obviously JSN still was productive. So, you know, we're good there, but yeah, don't look too much to these double-digit performances out of Kupp and Shaheed from this past week and expect them to repeat here in week 15, but they're at least in the risky flex conversation going into the week. Moving along, we have the Packers traveling to face the Broncos. A big matchup here for both teams involved in terms of playoff seeding. Let's start with the Packers. Another big week for Christian Watson. We talked about him a lot this past week. He was a must-start player for me. Had him in Sunday morning's video. Really encourage you guys to roll with him throughout the course of the week. 24.9 fantasy points, 4 targets, 4 catches, 89 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. He now has 5 receiving touchdowns in the last 4 games. And yeah, it's the Broncos defense, but this is a good spot for him actually because Pat Surtain is likely to shadow Romeo Doubs, who will line up as the wide receiver 1 for the Packers. Now we got Jaden Reed back in the mix, Dontavion Wicks, Matthew Golden looming around as well. So I actually like this spot a lot for Christian Watson. Yeah, the Broncos 8th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, but this is going to be a spot where he's going to see less defensive pressure, and it's a big game for both of these teams. This game does kind of have low scoring written all over it and defense written all over it, But I'm going to roll with Christian Watson and continue to consider him a start. And once again, like, this is not a player that you likely drafted, or that if you did, you drafted him super late and stashed him all year long. So you have other wide receivers in front of him. If you're starting him, he's like a flex option, but a very strong one. So I'm going to leave him in the start category. Romeo Doubs, 0 fantasy points this past week because, he was basically the one seeing the number one corner pressure and defensive pressure to open up things for Christian Watson, right? And Jaden Reed in his return, 9.3 fantasy points. So these guys are risky flexes. They can always do something. They can always see the involvement. This Matt LaFleur system, they will spread the football around quite a bit here. But yeah, Matthew Golden, 0 fantasy points. Dontavion Wicks did have an ankle injury, but 0 fantasy points after, he made his yearly outing of 28 fantasy points randomly on Thanksgiving Day. So Reed, Dobbs, very risky, but they are flex considerations. And then Watson, I'm rolling with them. And I'm also going to continue to roll with Courtland Sutton, 12.2 fantasy points this past week, 10 targets, 6 catches, 62 receiving yards, no touchdown, but still a solid overall fantasy performance. It is a much tougher matchup. Packers 12th against wide receivers on the season. You compare that to the Raiders, who are 28th, bottom 5. But Sutton sees the volume. This is a big game for the Broncos at home. I'm going to keep rolling with them. Maybe he's a lower end start due to the matchup here, but I still like him. I have moved Troy Franklin down to the sit category out of the flex option. Only 7 targets, 5 catches over the last 2 games since they've come out of bye week. We've seen some other guys get involved. We've seen the run game be a bit more effective as of late, at least in these last 2 matchups. There's been more of an emphasis, so I do not want to risk him. I'm going to go ahead and leave him as a sit. Pat Bryant, Marvin Mims, whoever else is left here, there's just nobody you can really trust. Really the only consistent option as of late has been Courtland Sutton. Once again, big game here, so I'm going to continue to start Courtland Sutton going into Week 15. All right, to wrap up the afternoon slate, we have the Titans traveling to face the 49ers coming out of their bye week. So let's look at this Titans offense to start. I went back and forth on just calling all these guys sits, but I'm going to leave Chimere DK in the risky flex category if you guys are hurting at wide receiver flex options, because the Niners are still in the bottom 10 against opposing wide receivers, and DK always has the ability to score or do something on special teams, so he's very risky. I mean, we just look at the last 2 weeks. Negative fantasy points in Week 13. 13.4 this past week in Week 14. But I am a little worried here that the Niners, Robert Saleh, great defensive coordinator, extra time to rest, prepare, get ready for this game. Bigger game for the Niners, obviously, than it is for the Titans. That the Titans could come out here and be very flat offensively on the road against the Niners. But DK, risky flex. I'm not going to consider any other Titans wide receiver. Although, let's give the Titans offense a little bit of credit. They've had some life as of late, but nothing that we can really trust from a fantasy perspective. Then we look to the Niners wide receivers. Okay, I really like Jawan Jennings this week. I think he's a must-start wide receiver. The Titans still struggling against the pass. They've improved against the run. They're okay against quarterbacks, but bottom 10 against wide receivers. I think this is a great spot for Jawan Jennings, who we look since Week 9, 4 receiving touchdowns, double digits in 4 out of 5 games. Once again, I'm always looking for offenses coming out of their bye week in terms of having, potential upside, extra time to rest, prepare. Great spot for Jawan Jennings here. Has to be a must-start wide receiver, and he has a great strength of schedule, getting the Colts next week and the Chicago Bears in Week 17. Really strong player here in the fantasy playoffs. But I do want to talk about Ricky Pearsall, because he's definitely gotten dropped in a lot of leagues with 3.4 or less fantasy points in each of the games, returning from injury, then being on bye week in Week 14. If you have roster room, I will consider stashing him just due to the matchups once again here in the playoffs, all bottom 10 units against wide receivers. So maybe he wasn't fully healthy, kind of slowly eased back in. But remember, he was having like 19 plus expected fantasy points in each game the first 4 games of the season. Now, be it Jawan Jennings was, or at least inactive in one of those games, but there could be some life here for Ricky Pearsall to end the season and the Niners. But once again, it's an offense with a lot of firepower with Christian McCaffrey and George Kittle there as well, than Jennings having success. But I don't want to call Ricky Pearsall like a risky flex or anything like that going into the week, but maybe a player to stash if you can afford to do so. And if not, just keep your eyes peeled, because I won't be surprised if he shows up in 1 or 2 of these end of season games. All right, then Sunday Night Football, we have the Vikings traveling to face the Cowboys. Okay, so Justin Jefferson, we called him a start last week. We said, come on, the matchup's there. They're at home. And actually, some of the theory was there. J.J. McCarthy was good this past week against the Commanders. He threw 3 touchdowns, but it just didn't have anything to do with Justin Jefferson or Jordan Addison at the end of the day. So, man, I can't do it. Come on. It's so tough here. If the matchup last week was good, the matchup this week is 10 times better. I mean, they get the Cowboys who've given up the most receiving touchdowns to wide receivers, the most fantasy points to wide receivers, the most receiving yards to wide receivers. So, yeah, it's a great spot for Justin Jefferson, but what are we supposed to do here? It's week 15. It's the fantasy playoffs. He had 3.1 fantasy points, 2 catches this past week, okay? He's had 4 or less catches in every game but one since week 10, 5 or less catches in all of those games. It's just tough. It's a really tough call, and I got a bad feeling a lot of people are going to sit Justin Jefferson, then he will come through in this matchup, but, man, they're on the road. I still don't trust this Vikings offense at the end of the day. If you want to start him, I am not going to blame you. I'm really not, because the matchup is as good as it gets. But if you want to set him, I also can't blame you. At this point, after putting my faith in him in week 14, and I know it's not Justin Jefferson's fault, and he's still pretty high in terms of overall targets in the NFL and all of that, and it's just a tough spot. Even Addison had 10 fantasy points this past week, so I don't know. JJ, Addison, they're in flex consideration due to the matchup, but man, I'm just done. I'm calling them sits. I'm moving on. It's going to depend on who else you guys have. The matchup is there. I won't blame you if you want to start them. And yeah, it's a tough call at the end of the day, but I'm putting them as sits this week. All right. CeeDee Lamb, the concussion this past week, questionable going into the week. So far, he's had no setbacks in concussion protocol. He's still at 18.1 fantasy points, was dominating against the Lions before he went out with a concussion. And it is a tough spot this week, guys. The Vikings, fewest fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. But I still think that him and George Pickens, he only had 8.7 fantasy points this past week, have to be starts going into the week because this is such a big game for the Cowboys. And yeah, the Vikings defense will show up, although this team doesn't have really anything to play for here. They will show up. We saw that this past week. They are a good defense at the end of the day, and they can undoubtedly limit the wide receiver position. But Lamb, Pickens, first round of the playoffs, as long as Lamb is active, regardless of if he's active or not, Pickens, both these guys have to be in your starting lineups. Even if they have lower ceilings, you got to roll with these guys. And then Ryan Flournoy can be a flex option. Sorry, he should have an asterisk if CeeDee Lamb is out, but a risky flex at that, once again, due to the matchup. Bear in mind, he showed up against the Lions, but the Lions have given up the second most fantasy points, only behind the Cowboys, to wide receivers all year long. So he's a risky flex if Lamb is out. If Lamb plays, I'm not going to play Ryan Flournoy against the Vikings this week. But we'll see how it shakes out. Tough matchup for the Cowboys wide receivers. Not a tough matchup for the Vikings wide receivers, but boy, is it hard to trust them. Let me know if you guys own JJ or Addison, what you are doing in the comments down below. All right, then let's wrap up the week with the Dolphins traveling to face the Steelers. Jalen Waddle came through in week 14. We had him as a start last week, even after 2 down performances, but he had 18.1 fantasy points this past week. 7 targets, 5 catches, 50 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Gets a struggling Steelers secondary that's been poor all season long. In terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, bottom 10. And the playoff hopes and dreams are still alive here for the Dolphins. And it's a big game for the Steelers as well, as they try to stay atop of their division. So I like the game script here. I like the potential. Jalen Waddle remains a start. Can't trust any other Dolphins wide receiver, unfortunately. Now, when it comes to DK Metcalf, I'm leaving him as a flex. I know he had the big game, 21.8 fantasy points, 12 targets, 7 catches, 148 receiving yards. He is dealing with some stomach issues, but so he's technically listed as questionable going into the week. I don't think it's particularly going to matter. I would almost be willing to bet that he will play. It is a tough matchup. The Dolphins have been good against wide receivers, 9th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. But, Metcalf remains a flex, and yes, he's been frustrating, and he's had 9.9 or less fantasy points in every game since week 9 except for 2, so he's very risky. But he remains a flex because of games like this past week. We know what he can do, can always pop off, can always make those big catches. So in the flex category, I'm not worried about the stomach issues or anything. And at least Aaron Rodgers and this offense showed some life this past week against the Ravens. And they're still fighting to stay atop of that division. The Dolphins fighting to stay in the playoff push. So it's a big game here on Monday Night Football. Metcalf should be a solid flex. And there you guys have it. Every single matchup, every single wide receiver, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting here in Week 15 of the fantasy season. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comments down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever, moving into the first round of the fantasy playoffs, please let me know. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor. Helps out the channel tremendously if you guys subscribe and hit that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, don't forget, guys, we'll have everything that you guys will need to dominate the first week of the fantasy playoffs here on the channel. So make sure you guys are going and checking out all the content as the week progresses. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.